Ah, the licensed game. A staple of the channel, and something that it's always good to revisit, especially now that it's nearing Christmas. YouTube being as it is, I think that just about all the famous Christmas games have been covered somewhat. So how about something that should always be done at Christmas? It's a time where everyone sits around the telly and puts on a classic where fins get blown up, people get gibbed, and pithy one-liners punctuate every poor sod's demise. It's time for Willis, Schwarzenegger, Stallone, and all the other favourites. And so, to commemorate this long-standing tradition that I've just made up, I've pulled some more 80s action games from the archives, ones that I haven't covered all that much in the past. Some of these are good enough that you might well think about playing them yourself, some are really quite lousy, and some are really weird to the point where you wonder just how they're related to the movie, or they're just not that well known. It all makes for a bit of light entertainment. And before we start, I should mention that this video is thoroughly affiliated with In Search of the Last Action Heroes, a new documentary by Oliver Harper and Creator VC that tells the story of these buff badasses, complete with a lot of the people who were there. Go back the pre-release campaign now, you'll find a link to it in the description. Go on, support creators who are taking it to the next level. Anyway, let's go down memory lane. Let's start with two obvious movies, the two classics of 80s action that are actually set on Christmas. No festive season is complete without viewings of Die Hard and Lethal Weapon. They're both great, and they're both Christmas movies. That's not a subject that's up for debate. Let's start with old John McClane first. There are obvious ones here like Die Hard Trilogy on the PS1, an undisputed classic, Die Hard Arcade on the arcade, and of course the ultra-faithful NES game, which to me is one of the best licensed games ever made. But we're not here for obvious, we're here for weird, and for that we have to go to the PC Engine for a game made by the same folks who did the NES game. Now I was really excited for this one, because maybe it's a souped up version of that NES classic. Well, it's not. Instead it's, it's weird. You kinda know it's weird already when the first stage sticks you in a jungle. You know, that famous jungle right in the heart of Los Angeles, next to the Fox Plaza, complete with a river that you can wade around in. Various other stages take place in locales that don't really have much to do with the movie at all, they're usually short aside from the odd maze-like pain in the arse, and there's a couple of bosses that could be relevant to the movie, there's a helicopter, a giant coal, although strangely at no point do you fight Hans. As you can probably tell from the Japanese text, this game never made it to the West. It's kind of easy to see why, as it has precious little to do with the movie, and feels like a game that was virtually already finished before Packin Video, or Activision rather, got the license and basically shoved Bruce Willis and a couple of other things into it just before it went out the door. But is it good? Not really. It's painfully mediocre as far as these things go, especially on a platform that's got a couple of really good top-down gunners already. I mean, why on earth would you play this when you could play Bloody Wolf? Or hell, Last Alert, which is basically an utterly outrageous 80s action movie without the licence. With competition like that, Die Hard doesn't stand a chance, and is only really notable for how thoroughly unrelated it is to the source material. I'd stick with the almighty NES game. What about Lethal Weapon then? Usually Lethal Weapon games come in for a bit of a kick-in, particularly the console ones. All of them were released by Ocean, and they don't tend to be the most popular amongst console gamers. However, there's one of these games that I would happily go to bat for. If you want the best out of Riggs and Murtaugh, go and have a look at the Amiga version. They're all kind of different in many ways, but this one is a straight-ahead and quite fast-paced platformer, and it actually works nicely. Why so? It's presented very well for a start. You've got some bloody good music and sound effects, much better than any of the other versions. And even with having to use up for jump, the controls are pretty tight. Good thing too, because this game is rock hard. You get knocked back severely whenever you're hit, instant death is all about everywhere, your ammo is very limited, and you can't take that many hits to begin with. This is a severe challenge, although I wouldn't say it's overly unfair, not when compared to some other microcomputer licenses. I quite like this game. It's definitely one of the best of Ocean's later licensed games on the 16 bits, and it doesn't tend to get much love because most of the other games with the Lethal Weapon name tend to be quite poorly regarded. This though is definitely worthy. So, with the two obligatory Christmas classics out of the way, we've had a weird game and a good game. So now I think it's time for something bad. Poor old Arnold Schwarzenegger has had his fair share of lousy licenses under his belt, and none more so than Last Action Hero, a game I've already given several kickings to in the past, particularly the Mega Drive game. But I haven't really touched the Amiga one that much, which is a different and terrible beast all of its own that's easily the worst game ever to carry the Psygnosis banner. This is one of those licensed games where you know you're in trouble before the game even starts. The first stage pick's recreation of Arnold is by far the worst recreation of the Austrian oak ever seen in a video game, and that's up against some pretty stiff competition. The game itself is an incredibly bare bones beat 'em up. No weapons, no power-ups, no food, only a few bad guys to fight. There's only a couple of things to note. You can just hold a direction and the button and do moves for all eternity, which is kinda fun because you can then make Jack Slater headband to the admittedly kinda rockin' music. This built-in autofire also makes the game rather easy if you know what you're doing. So long as you can get enemies in front of you, you alternate between punch and spin kick, which won't knock enemies down until they're dead and means they can't get close to you at all. It certainly makes boss fights trivial. These silly things aside, the game is positively wretched. This underrated movie just couldn't catch a break with its licensed games, which are uniformly the absolute drizzling pits. But as far as 80s action beat-em-ups go, it's nothing compared to what's coming next. Big Trouble in Little China is one of the most outright fun 80s action movies of them all. It's got mysticism, guns, kung fu, Kurt Russell, Lopan, an endlessly quotable script, direction by John Carpenter. It's fantastical, and it's bloody fantastic. It was always going to be a struggle for the microcomputers of the 80s to recreate big action blockbusters, of course, but I put it forward that there is no greater disconnect between a film's quality and the absolute misery of its licensed game than Big Trouble in Little China. An absolutely horrific effort which appeared on micros only and is represented here in the very worst version of them all, the Spectrum version. So what do you do in this game? Well, you and your buddies walk left and that's it. Every so often you'll fight against one guy. You hold a direction down to punch or kick and hopefully you win. This repeats for basically the whole game with no music or decent sound to speak of, and occasionally the colour of the brick wall behind you will change. There is nothing else. The three characters represent your 3 lives, there's the odd power-up you can get here and there, but they're all basically the same. It's a shockingly boring title, it really is. Even with the limitations of the hardware, you expect so much more. And criminally, Electric Dreams were charging a bloody tenner for this when it first came out. Even the later budget release for Alternative would leave people feeling ripped off. So, why is this game so terrible? Well, I had a little look around. You might be shocked to know that this game was coded, although not designed, by the legendary Mevlut Dink, who'd later go on to produce games like First and Second Samurai. Anyway, at the exact same time this was being worked on, Electric Dreams were also devoting everything, and I do mean everything, and fully crunching away on their other big Christmas '86 movie tie-in, Aliens, with much the same people who were working on this. So basically this game is the very definition of a rushed out afterthought. The Aliens game itself, you know, that first person one, that's okay enough for what it is. However, Activision also released a US version of Aliens, which is a rather weird little licensed game in its own right. The US version of Aliens is one of those licensed games that follows the movie to an absurdly close level. Hell, it's even got excerpts from the movie's script. What you get here then is a collection of 6 minigames of varying quality. I fancy though that a lot of people didn't even get past the first of them, which involves you guiding the APC to Hadley's Hope through a whole load of ruins at breakneck speed. You thought that Superman 64 was hard? You ain't seen nothing. This is stupid difficult, and basically a single screw up means that you have to restart it, and it goes on for about 5 minutes. Fortunately there is a level skip code, and you may well want to use it for this one. After that, actually the rest of the game isn't bad. You try and get several soldiers back to the vehicle in a tense stage with xenomorphs creeping around everywhere, motion tracker and all. You fend off a whole load of them with a flamethrower while the door's being cut, you take a trip through the vents, you try to find Newt, and you have the battle with the alien queen where you plonk her through the hatch. You even have a big awesome get away from her you bitch picture to go along with it. This is a weird game as minigame collections tend to be, but actually a lot of it does work. It's legitimately one of the more atmospheric and even scary games on the 8-bit micros. That bloody rinse section though, seriously. Our next game technically isn't 80s action, it's not a film and it wasn't released, but I couldn't not quickly look at Steven Seagal is the final option on the SNES. It's a game that's worthy of a video in its own right, which we might get later. But also, well, it's the only opportunity in video games that you have to play as old Steve. His games are on thin ground. For whatever reason, no one decided to make a game from Under Siege, or Marked for Death, Out for Justice and so on, where you snap arms and necks and generally torture poor sods with your Aikido. This unreleased game, a project by TechMagic that was put on the net as part of a collector's treasure trove in the late 2000s, is as close as you can get. The plot is some sort of futuristic thing where Steven Seagal was following the stupid path of peace, but now he has to save someone and the bad guys are using time and who even gives a crap, let's get to the punching. You play as a digitised Steven Seagal and you punch, kick, throw, shoot and stab various other digitised badniks. Well, I say you play as Steven Seagal, actually you play as a lookalike of Steven Seagal, because that's not him, although he does have the requisite jeans, leather jacket and ponytail. TechMagic were too cheap to actually pay Steven to come into the studio, as it goes. Anyway, in the stages that you can complete, you have to gather the pieces for a bomb, set it, and make your way to the exit. Most of them are unfinished, but you can use codes to access most of what's here in the proto. As usual with Steven, bad guys pose literally no threat, especially not when, as in this proto, he has unlimited lives. You just tear them asunder. What does pose a threat to Steven is any sort of jumping. Half the time when you have to do that, you die, and you're treated to a wonderfully girly scream. This scream probably wouldn't have made it to the finished game, but the dev team put it in purely for their own amusement. Poor Steven, he just can't jump, he can't fly. The whole thing's finished off with some rocking music as it goes, and you get what, if it had been finished and all that, would have probably been a perfectly acceptable bit of digitised carnage. It's a lot better than, say, Experts on the Mega Drive. Why did it fail then? In short, TechMagic ran out of money. The game was supposed to be on Mega Drive too, although no ROM for that version is out there currently. According to folks who worked on the project, it was somewhat beset by trouble, predominantly producers who had no clue about either video games or anything that they were doing, and an unpleasant rivalry between the SNES and Mega Drive dev teams. It missed a 1994 release date, was moved to 95, but missed that too and then disappeared. TechMagic started work on another potential Seagal game called Deadly Hour for the 32-bits, which also never materialised, and the company bit the dust shortly after. It's an odd project. Funnily enough, Steven Seagal's lookalike ended up training with the real Finn not long after, and Steven himself was utterly confused by the existence of this project. It is an interesting story, this one, and at some stage, you know, it might be worth a full retelling. So we've had some weird stuff and some bad. To finish, I think we're just going to have 4 quite underrated licensed game smashers that you may not be totally aware of. First up, we have an iconic 80s name that usually gets bad games: Top Gun. It may not get much more 80s than this, but the games of Top Gun are by and large a really hideous bunch, from the infamous NES game through to the microcomputers, and even to more modern titles. However, I have found a good one. For this we have to go to licensed game ground that's actually still quite untouched, the Game Boy Advance. I fancy there's lots of good licensed game plunder here waiting to be unearthed, and this is an example: Top Gun Firestorm. And also, shockingly, this good game was published by Titus Interactive. The Red Fox gets it right. This is an isometric game where you play as Maverick, you fly your Tomcat around and blow the hell out of various targets: missiles, enemy bases, radar encampments, choppers, all that sort of thing. It should become apparent fairly quickly why this is quite enjoyable. Basically, it's a lot like a classic strike game, only in a plane that's a lot easier to control than the infamously tough one in that one stage of Jungle Strike. There's all sorts of things you can blow up on the ground, you go very fast, you occasionally go back to base for refueling and so on. It definitely scratches that itch for a classic strike game, with the added advantage of it being on the go. The presentation might not be the best or anything, although the music is actually quite good, and it does get challenging. Being in a plane, you certainly have to watch how you fly, seeing as any collision results in instant death. As far as Top Gun games go, it's very good indeed. Perhaps not an essential title, but definitely one that's worth a look if you want that strike-style gameplay, but you've already played the hell out of the classic trilogy. Up next, we have Robocop, specifically Robocop II. Ocean's tie-in for the sequel was, much like the sequel itself, okay enough but a bit more average on most platforms. There's still plenty of bad guys to shoot, but a bit more emphasis on puzzles and platforming than there was in the first game. They're acceptable without really being standouts. But there's one exception, and it's the exception that happened to come out on a very unpopular platform. The Amstrad GX4000 Robocop 2, also available on the Plus range, is a game that's so good it could sell this much maligned console all on its own. The game that, if other releases had shown a similar standard and care, could have seen the GX4000 actually achieve something. Robocop 2 is a game that genuinely shows what could have been, even with a system that most people would deem to be quite bad. Robocop 2 GX4000 actually goes even further into the puzzles and platforming formula that the other microcomputer versions dabbled with. There actually isn't all that many enemies to shoot, and most of the time you'll be taking on tricky jumping sequences and the like. Tricky being the operative word, because this game is famously challenging. There are things that help. Make sure you go into all the rooms that you can, because they act as checkpoints. And on top of that, just be careful. Spikes, electricity, barrels, the odd thug, they can all spell death for Murphy pretty sharpish. Hard the game may be though, the quality is up to it. It feels like a great game to play, with really solid and tight controls. It's tough, but it's not unfair. Graphics wise, it's great. It feels and looks like a 16-bit game, and the always excellent Jonathan Dunn supplies one of his best ever soundtracks. Even the puzzle and target range sections are good in this one. This is the sort of game that you wonder where on earth it came from. As mentioned, the GX4000 and its library weren't much good, filled mostly with straight ports of Ocean games from the plain old CPC. But then this game is not only really good, it's good enough that it would make you consider buying a GX purely to play it. Just, make sure you get a better power supply first so that it doesn't blow up. It's that good a game, absolutely one of Ocean's best licensed efforts. It's still as good today as it was when it came out too. Tough platformers continue to be all the rage, and this is certainly one that will give anybody a run for their money. Basically, yeah, you should try and play this game. It's an absolute gem. Our last two games are both on the PC Engine. First up, we've got Batman by Sunsoft. Kinda like Die Hard, you might be wondering if this is going to be a souped up version of a classic NES game, and instead you get something completely different that only came out in Japan. However, in this instance the game you get is a lot better, while being even more of an odd tie-in. What we have here is a top-down game that's sort of an in-between between Pac-Man and Bomberman, where old Bats has to perform tasks like collect the Joker's various chemicals dotted around, or plant bombs, or clean paintings. These tasks might seem a little trifling, but there's lots of the Joker's goons around, and you'll have to deal a Batarang to their face if you want to get past them, although they'll reappear again after a short while. The gameplay may not exactly be the most varied in the world, and Batman is so square in this game that he won't even cross a road unless he's at the properly designated crosswalk, but the core game is a lot of fun. You gradually power up your Bat and try to guard him jealously, because losing all your lives takes him right back to being a slow, lumbering oaf who can barely throw his Batarang 2 inches in front of him. The levels do get considerably more lengthy and complex as the game goes on, and as you would expect from a Sunsoft game, the music is awesome. You certainly need a PC Engine rendition of Streets of Desolation in your life, and this game delivers on that. There's been a few odd Batman games over the years, and this one is probably in competition with the old microcomputer isometric platformer for being the strangest of the lot. but both of them are very good indeed, and this one deserves a bit more than it gets. And finally, we have Blazing Lasers. Well, I mean, you probably all know this one actually. A PC Engine classic, one of Compil's best ever shooters, brilliant music, awesome weapons, a great difficulty curve. It's good. You're probably wondering why it's here in a video like this though. Well, most people don't know that Blazing Lasers is actually a licensed game, probably because the Western version, well, isn't. However, the Japanese version is. It's based on a sci-fi action film called Gunhead that's not exactly well known nowadays or particularly well liked. Still, with a big ship called the Gunhead in play, it makes sense to just make a straight space shooter out of it. And what a shooter it is. This for me is probably the best of Compile. Sometimes they can get a little convoluted and sometimes a little easy with their games, but this one is pretty straightforward and fun. Especially when you power up any of the 4 weapons to ludicrous levels, homing lasers, screen-filling waves, a virtual wall of plasma surrounding you. Enemies are welcome to try penetrating that. Of course they will probably get a lucky shot in soon enough, although as with a lot of Compile games you don't die immediately, instead gradually losing your power-ups before biting the dust and having to start all over again. The game's demanding, but this system means that it's not Gradius levels of unfairness, where you may as well restart the whole game after dying once. This is one of those shooters that screams out classic, probably one of the quintessential examples of Compile's work, the one that you would show to someone who hadn't played any of them before as an example of just what they're like. The sort of game that once you start playing, it's a real struggle to put down. It's just the right length for a shooter, and it'll give you plenty of entertainment no matter how you play it. And the loose connection to a rather lousy and cringy Japanese 80s action movie means that we can end this video on a very high note indeed. So hopefully you've enjoyed this little look at some licenses you may not have been all that aware of. But we're not quite done with licenses this month. I have something else for you. One of the weirdest and one of the worst that will take us right into the heart of utterly baffling British television. But until that's out, it's goodbye. Bye for now. Thank you for watching this video on good, bad and weird 80s action licensed games. If you like the video, please do like, comment, subscribe and all of that, and do consider supporting me on Patreon, where you could join this list of glorious people here who I would like to thank. Alexander Jazeri, Andrew Dalton, Andy Capt, Daniel Briggs, Daniel Dave Taylor, Dave Cork, David Rose, Dustin Cooper, Gary Pinkett, Geordie Alex, James Loveridge, Jason Goy, Jason Stevens, Jace Alexander, Lee Norris, Martin Pataki, Nicholas Tristan, Peter Jack, Filter Prog, Potter Margel, Quan DX, Rachel Maxwell, Ren Bimon, Rock 2000, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Yerka Operator, and Zach Roach.